One of the other keys to Cosimo's success in erecting a stable Grand Duchy was the fact that he married extremely well. He married Eleonora of Toledo in 1539, when she was only 17, and he was extremely lucky in the choice of his wife. He had intended to marry Margaret, who was the illegitimate daughter of Charles V and who was the widow of Alessandro, but Margaret ends up getting shipped off to marry the grandson of a pope, I believe, much to her dismay. She's quite used to living in Florence by that point. But even if that match didn't work out, we could say actually that Cosimo probably dodged a bullet. And in Eleonora, he really found his equal. She was quite wealthy. She was the daughter of a very, very rich nobleman in Spain who was serving then as the viceroy in Naples. She herself, came from quite exactly a wealthy background. And she's also very intelligent. She's very lively. And luckily for both of them, she's also very fertile. They have many children together, 2 sons, 3 sons who live into adulthood, and more than ample heirs for the continuance of the hereditary Grand Duchy. But more than that, she's reliable, she's intelligent, and she's cunning. She is one who rules when Cosimo is away, or in certain cases when he was been gravely ill. She not only sat at his bedside, but also ran the state when he was not able to. She's also rather just delightful. She, you might say, is the key to creating a new aristocratic court where none existed. She's a blue blood. She comes from that background. She's skilled in manipulating an aristocracy. She's also notoriously fond of gambling, and she's capricious. She changes her mind frequently, so she becomes quite the figure at court, the central figure, if you will. And she really knows the rules of the game, how to function in an aristocratic society, which certainly there had always been an elite kind of culture in Florence. But this is, a new game, having a court in which you have court rules, regulations, and games and other sort of entertainments that just hadn't really existed before around the person of the Duke and Duchess. Not only that, she and Cosimo really were a love match. Until her death, they are really just practically inseparable. They go everywhere together. She's famous for even going hunting with him into the late stages of her pregnancies. So we can never overlook the consort in this case. She's really quite key to Cosimo's successful creation of a court and really a dukedom in Tuscany. Also, another thing is that they buy Palazzo Pitti together with a large part of her personal wealth. And as you can tell, Palazzo Pitti is really much grander than Palazzo Vecchio. It is a fitting place for an aristocratic family to grow up. As I mentioned earlier, Eleonora constantly lamented the fact that the Palazzo Vecchio was old, it was outdated, it was out of fashion. It's really not a place where you can hold court. Palazzo Pitti, on the other hand, is. And not only that, it is enormous, and it is absolutely overpowering. It sends the right message, and it's also very defensible. If you have the chance ever to go to Florence, I highly recommend that you stop by Palazzo Pitti and really marvel at what a defensible construction it is. It is not just a palace, it is also a fortress, as indeed many of the other Florentine families' palazzi were in the late medieval and early modern period. But thinking further along military lines, in addition to having kind of the perpetual threat of Spanish troops, the support of Charles V in his pocket, and in addition to his new bureaucratizing of the state, the clever management of his money, and his extremely fortunate marriage, he's also quite accomplished militarily. And his biggest military success, and indeed the key to creating what is now the sort of recognizable territory of the Grand Duchy, is the conquest of Siena in 1555. So Siena had been occupied by imperial troops since 1541. And in 1552, aided by some of these Florentine exiles, again, they never really go away. They rebel. Now, Cosimo is from, as we'll recall, has a bit of a military background. His father was Giovanni delle Bandinere, so he's used to growing up in a kind of military environment, and he really styles himself as kind of the warrior duke, which is more than evident in this excellent portrait that's done by Agnolo Bronzino. He has a special coat of armor commissioned to be made especially for this portrait. So in order to kind of reinforce not only his political stability, but also really his kind of self-image as a conqueror, he goes off, and with the help of the Holy Roman Emperor and aided by large loans from mostly foreign sources, Cosimo puts together a polyglot army of Spanish, German, and Italian troops, and he goes off to subdue Siena. No Florentines, though. He makes very clear that he doesn't accept Florentine troops in his army. Again, he's still leery of any sort of influence of the exiles or kind of the family plots that tend to materialize in Florence. So he takes this army and marches them south to Siena, where in the Battle of Marciano, the Sienese troops, who unfortunately never got the French reinforcements that they were counting on, were crushed by Cosimo's army. Again, in this case, the exile leaders are taken back to Florence, and they are brutally and very publicly executed. Siena itself resists a siege until April of 1555, at which time it is subdued. Although pockets of resistance do remain in the countryside, which keeps Cosimo's armies and Cosimo himself busy campaigning for a few years afterward. An important piece of propaganda, Cosimo has Vasari immortalize the campaign and its planning. He takes all the credit for the planning of the campaign on the ceiling of the Sala d'Udienza. So this is the great hall, the hall that had previously been erected back in the day of Savonarola for the Great Council. Well, Cosimo takes the Great Council's hall and he turns it into a sort of throne room. The Udienza is actually a place where you hear the petitioners and where you receive state diplomats, foreign emissaries, that sort of thing. And he makes it really a magnificent monument to his own rule and to the conquests and accomplishments of other Medici rulers by having the whole thing refrescoed by Vasari and others. And he does the same thing in other parts of the Palazzo Vecchio. So if you really think about the visual landscape of the dukedom, of his rule, you have Cosimo commissioning painters and architects and artists to go on kind of a PR blitz in which you have these magnificent paintings which are glorifying Cosimo's rule and the rule of the Medici being put up all over the place. You have new coins being minted, which are circulated throughout Tuscany and abroad, which feature his face on them. And you also have any kind of law or proclamation being pasted up around the city in his name rather than in the name of the Florentine government. Cosimo is everywhere. He seems inescapable, which of course is all very deliberately done. The only thing that's lacking and that still irks Cosimo and is the one impediment to him really having a traditional aristocratic rule in Florence in the same manner as other rulers have in different parts of Europe at that time, is a title that is independent of the imperial legitimation that had been so important to putting Alessandro in place. So up until 1569, he is Duke of Florence and Siena. He is the second Duke of Florence after Alessandro. But this really isn't sufficient. So after much wrangling, he's able to get Pope Pius V to proclaim him Grand Duke. So Tuscany becomes a Grand Duchy, the Granducato, and his title is confirmed, or it's agreed to, by the Holy Roman Emperor, which means that the Grand Duchy itself becomes more independent under Cosimo's rule, and moreover that his position is hereditary. The idea is that it will pass on to his sons. So you see here a depiction of Cosimo being confirmed or crowned, if you will, as Grand Duke by Pope Pius V in a ceremony in 1570. And on the left-hand side, you see the Medici coat of arms with the 6 balls on the shield. So we have essentially from a very unstable, politically volatile Republican, if you will, Florence, in 1530, by 1570, so approximately 40 years later, a fully functioning aristocratic dominion. Cosimo, by this time in 1570, is getting on in years. In 1564, he had handed over all effective power to his son, Francesco I, which is a rather canny political move because it ensures that there won't be any squabbling over who is going to rule after he dies. And he does die 10 years later in 1574. He's been getting up there in years for quite a while, is a bit physically infirm, and he decides at a certain point in 1574 to go and watch a game of calcio, which is soccer, and he gets a bit of a cold, and he lingers on for another 2 months and finally expires in 1574. But what he left behind was a fully functioning regime, an extensive, well-running bureaucracy, a nobility that was dependent on the crown, a new navy to patrol the seas, and his private reserves, his coffers being full to the brim of scudi. And not to mention that, a territorial empire. So he leaves behind all this to his sons, to Francesco I, who will rule in his stead. For this week, then, in addition to your secondary source reading, which will cover many of the same themes that I have mentioned here, you'll be reading the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, who is one of my all-time favorite historical figures because he is such a character. His autobiography is considered to be a very important source in the development of self-reflective writings in Western literature. There's a long tradition of a sort of autobiography or memoirs from St. Augustine all the way up to Montaigne and beyond in the 16th century. And Cellini is part of this because he pens his autobiography in and around, I think, the 1560s. So he's recounting his life, and it's a very colorful life it was too. He's from Florence, but he spends a good deal of his life moving around Tuscany and also in other parts of Italy. He travels extensively in his work as a goldsmith, and you'll be reading more about his life, obviously, in the autobiography. And you might want to keep an eye out for some of the themes that we have already covered in this course, and for the way that patronage still features prominently even in the 16th century, and the relationship that Cellini had with his patrons is very interesting. So happy reading, and I will see you all on the discussion boards.